Kia ora boys, we are here today because we are going to listen to a talk on the 1981 Springbok Tour. We are super lucky to have these members of staff who are able to share their perspectives with you, and they are all different, which is amazing. So we're very, very lucky, and I think we all need to appreciate that. So you're going to hear a range of perspectives on the 1981 Springbok Tour. Some of them will be different to your own. Some of them may be challenging or difficult, and that's okay because that's history. Yeah? And also the thing about perspectives is that people's perspectives can change over time. So the point of you listening to this talk is that you get an appreciation, especially because we have an internal assessment coming up about the historical significance of events. And I want you to understand, really understand how significant this event was for not only people in New Zealand, but people in South Africa and around the world. So listen closely, because we'll also be talking about this event tomorrow in class. So listen closely and make sure that you pay attention, because these staff members are going to be talking to you, but they've also given up their time to be here with us as well. So I want you to really appreciate that. So I want to just thank, in case I don't have a chance at the end because we don't have time, I just want to make a chance to say thank you so much for giving up your time to be here. So thank you, Mr. Lobb, thank you, Mrs. Lobb, thank you, Mr. Hemara, thank you, Mr. Turner, and thank you, Mr. Carlton. I really appreciate this. We're going to start with Mr. Lobb, so thank you.
Well done. Thanks. Thanks, Andy. So, boys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about my time in the Springbok Tour, 1981. So I suppose the best thing for us to do when I talk about my time in the 1981 Springbok Tour is to give you a little bit of context of who I was as a young man back then. So I was 20 years of age. I had joined the police force. Some of you might not know that, but I was in the police force for close on 22 years. In that time, I did a lot of time in South Auckland. I was in the task force unit in South Auckland, riot squad during the Springbok Tour. And then when I started, my wife and I, Debbie, started to have our family, I moved back to Palmerston North, and I was a dog handler here in Palmerston North. And then at the ripe old age of 40, I was actually around about 41 when I finally did sign out, I left. I always made that decision in my head that I would only stay in the police force for 20 years. And I said at my farewell when I left the police force that what had happened when I was 20, I was chasing 20-year-olds, and when I left at 41, I was still chasing 20-year-olds, and they were getting faster and I was getting slower. Luckily, I had the dog who could run faster than they could, so he did most of the work for me towards the end. But I'm going to go right back now to when I first joined the police force. What had happened was, to sort of set the picture, what had happened was there were people talking about South Africa and the policy of apartheid that existed in South Africa. And one of those people was an old boy of the school. That's the old boy of our school here, Bob Burgess. There's a couple of shots there. That's a photo of Bob when he was an All Black, and that's beside him is a photo of when he came and spoke to the school at assembly. And I always remember as a young getting ready to go to high school student, Bob Burgess. And Bob Burgess, for me, defined what integrity really was. One of our 6 values, of course, is integrity. And what happened was in 1970, Bob Burgess, and you've got to remember back then, people would have sold their grandmother to be an All Black. That's how everyone who was living in New Zealand at the time saw being an All Black. It was something that you wanted to aspire to be. And in 1970, when they were looking to select an All Black team to tour South Africa, they picked a whole lot of trialists, and Bob Burgess, an old boy of this school, declined the invitation to trial for the All Blacks. He said, no, I'm not interested, I don't agree with what you are doing, and I don't agree with the fact that you will be touring South Africa, because I don't believe in the system that operates in South Africa at that time. And I always remember the shock and horror that someone who was as good as Bob Burgess, and he was a brilliant rugby player, he, at the time that he was nominated to trial for the All Blacks, he was a first 5'8", played for Manawatū, and Manawatū were pretty good in those days. They were Ranfurly Shield holders, they were one of the top provinces in all of New Zealand, the team to beat. And Bob Burgess came out and announced that he would turn down the invitation to trial for the All Blacks, and he most probably thought that that was the end of his rugby career. He would carry on and play provincial, but he most probably would never aspire to playing international rugby. But thankfully he was given the opportunity later on, and he actually did successfully join the All Black team after they had returned from South Africa, but he'd refused. So that gives you a picture of some of the language and some of the communication that was going on. In 1974, so this is well before 81, we had a Commonwealth Games here in New Zealand, and it was in Christchurch. And I remember distinctly as being a student in high school then, the excitement by the students that were at school, because it would be the first time that we would ever see colour television. At that stage, everything was black and white. New Zealand did not have the technology to broadcast a colour transmission to a television. And I remember, I don't know if you guys here remember them, but I think the first one was a K9 Philips K9 colour television. It was huge, and it just stood this big and about that deep, and cost you around about $3,000 back then, which was damn near the cost of a car in those days. So people would purchase these colour televisions, and I can remember the Commonwealth Games, the first broadcast, sitting there. I would have been a year 10, year 11 student, and seeing the first transmission of a colour moving image on a television. So back then things weren't as they are now. So 74 was the Commonwealth Games, and the one thing that I remember from the 74, come in and find a seat up there, the 74 Commonwealth Games was the 1500 metres, and there was a runner in the 1500 metres who broke the world record. His name was Philbert Baye from Tanzania, and he won the gold medal at the Commonwealth Games in 74. And second, taking the silver medal, was a guy by the name of John Walker, a New Zealand runner. And everyone was rubbing their hands together, waiting for them to run against each other in the 76 Montreal Olympics. So after the Commonwealth Games, they were all looking forward to that happening. So what happens is, we end up with a little bit of unrest in South Africa. And I don't want to dampen down what was happening in South Africa, and I know Mr. Trudeau will talk a wee bit about this, but what happened in 76, and I know I'm jumping ahead a few years, but just to give you an idea of the landscape of how my formation came about. In 76, in a township just out of Johannesburg called Soweto, there was a riot. My understanding of the riot was that the students that were there in Soweto were being told that they had to, if they wanted to go to school, they had to engage in the education that was being offered in English. However, a lot of the students, and I would most probably hazard guess, I don't know, but I would say all of them spoke a different language. And their argument was they're most probably not going to do very well learning everything and being instructed in a foreign language, a language they did not understand. And they protested. they march. These are school children. These are children at primary school age. These are children your age. And there would be our year 9s and 10s. And what happened was, unfortunately, the police opened fire on the protestors, and there's an iconic photo that you can see of Hector Peterson. He's the young man that was fatally shot. Now, a number were shot and killed throughout that rioting situation. And there's a picture of him being carried by an 18-year-old, would have been described as a Soweto man, and that's his young sister running beside him as they're running to seek medical attention for Hector. Unfortunately, Hector wouldn't have received the medical attention he needed because he actually passed away as a result of the gunshot wound. So 1976 was an important year. 76 was also the year that the All Blacks toured South Africa. Now, what happened was the All Blacks toured South Africa, and their first game in South Africa, and I remember their first game in South Africa, it was border Western Cape Province or something like that. It was a team that they had merged together. That was their first game, and that was only 2 weeks after that young man that you saw was part of that riot in Soweto. So 2 weeks after that event, the All Blacks had arrived in South Africa. And as you can appreciate, the All Blacks arriving in South Africa 2 weeks after an event like that meant that the whole world was talking about why are they there? Why are they there playing in South Africa after that had occurred? So you had a number of countries questioning the integrity of New Zealand and the fact that they were sending an All Black rugby team to play South African teams and play test matches against South Africa. So in 76, and I think there's a picture there of Sid Going, who only just recently passed away, one of our better halfbacks that played for the All Blacks. And Sid Going is of Māori descent from North Auckland, so he played for North Auckland with his two brothers. I don't remember the name of them. Ken and Brian. Ken and Brian. Here we go. So everyone here knows who I'm talking about there. So 2 weeks after the Soweto riot, the All Blacks are playing their first game on South African soil, and the whole world's asking the question, why are you there? After what had happened, why are you supporting that country and the sport that you're playing in? Of course, also in the backdrop was the fact that if you were a Pacific or Māori player in the All Blacks, to be accepted to play in South Africa, you had to become an honorary white person to play in South Africa. Prior to that, they didn't even select Pacific Island and Māori people or players of that heritage because they weren't allowed to go to South Africa and play in South Africa. However, when South Africa came here, of course, they were allowed to play in those All Black teams. So things were very different in 76. So what happens in 76? The All Blacks, remember, still touring, still playing their games in South Africa, so they're still there. I think the opening ceremony of the Montreal 1976 Olympics, I think the All Blacks were playing Western Province, maybe it was about the 6th game of the tour in South Africa, and the Montreal Olympics have their opening ceremony. Now we'll be seeing that on Saturday in France, so you know what a spectacle that will be if you watch what happens in France on Saturday when they open the Olympic Games there. They open the Olympic Games. I think 26 countries decided that they would not go to the Olympic Games because New Zealand was competing at the Olympic Games. And one of those countries, actually the first country to declare they would not be sending a team to the Olympic Games was Tanzania. And Tanzania was where Phil Bapaya was from, and he was not allowed to go and run in the 1500 metre final against John Walker. And John Walker, at the 76 Montreal Olympic Games, won a gold medal for New Zealand at that Games. So we're going to talk a little bit about politics and sport, and how people said politics should not be involved in sport in any way. And that was the mantra, the cry for 1981. Prime Minister of New Zealand at the time, Robert Muldoon, decided that the South African rugby team would tour. The rugby union and a person by the name of Speirs Centre had issued an invitation to South Africa, and it had been accepted, and they were coming to play us here in New Zealand in 1981. So, throughout the decade before the 80s, you were having all these protests and all these people talking about not supporting South African teams because they did not want to encourage apartheid to remain in South Africa, and by restricting their sporting contact with the world, we might force the government in South Africa to change their policy. So 1981, I'm 20 years old, I've joined the police force. You had to be 20 or older because the liquor licensing laws at that time said that no one under the age of 20 could go into a pub and drink any alcohol at all, unless you were partaking in a meal. I think that would be right from my memory of the Sale of Liquor Act. It was, so you had to be over the age of 20 to be in the police force, or you could not even go into a pub to enforce the Liquor Licensing Act. So I joined the police force. I was part of a group of guys, a squad of guys. They were given the title of task force, and we walked around and we wore this helmet here. This is the helmet that we wore as a task force member, a blue helmet. People or police officers that walked the beat would wear a white helmet. This is a white helmet, a beat helmet. And police officers that drove around in a car, they wore what we called a forage cap, which is a flat top cap with a peak in it. Nowadays they wear baseball caps and things like that, but in our day we had headdress that we had to wear. It was either a blue helmet, task force, a white helmet if you're a beat cop, and they were those elderly men or police officers that walked around and talked to people during the day in the shopping centres, went to schools and spoke to the kids, and then you had your high-card staff wearing forage caps. They drove around in cars and attended incidents throughout the 24-hour period of a day. Task force, we only worked Thursday, Friday and Saturday night, and we would start at 6 o'clock at night and we would finish when everyone had gone home, usually around about 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. We would always have Tuesdays as a court day, which meant you had to go and give evidence in court. If you arrested people, Wednesdays was a training day, but every day was a training day for task force. We ran every day, and we ran some mind-blowing miles. You know, they would send us on a 15-mile run from one part of South Auckland to another part of South Auckland. 35 guys all running down the road during the day, and in the hot summer days we would run around. You knew task force had arrived because when they got out of their cars they had to put on their headdress, and we wore those blue helmets there. So everyone would look out and go, oh, they're task force. We dealt with disorder, mainly drunken disorder and gang type gatherings and things like that. So we had in those days when I joined the police force, you had a specific group of officers that dealt with those people, and each of the stations in Auckland had around about 30, 35 men that were solely doing their job. They would have a whole lot of guys that were beat cops, and they would have a whole lot of guys that were A-car cops, and they would drive around and deal with the general duties. If you went to a riot situation, like in 81, you wore a riot helmet, and what you always carried with you was a baton, and you'll see a bit of footage. I've got some footage of the police and that there, and all police officers, when we were in the police force, all carried a baton like this, a short wooden baton, and the trousers that we wore in those days had a long pocket at the back, behind this pocket here, and that would slip in there, and the leather tassel would leap into your belt, so you could pull it out quickly, spin it around, and you would have it ready. So you will see police officers with those buttons and these type of helmets on, and the ones with the riot helmets on. That was what I was during the '81 Springbok Tour. So what happened is there was disorder. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of footage with a few facts and a few words written on this. This is what it ended up being like. But I'll talk a wee bit about what it was like at the start, because this is what actually we ended up dealing with over the weeks that the South African rugby team were here in '81. And it progressively got more and more violent, and the riots turned into what you would, most probably imagine a real riot situation would be. Chaos, mayhem, smoke, rocks and bottles being thrown, police running up and down the road, protesters and helmets to protect their heads and carrying shields. So have a look at this. So what you've seen is how the conflict between the police and the protesters slowly spiralled upwards into a more violent situation. And that was, they're just a few snippets of what was happening on Wednesdays and Saturdays throughout the whole of New Zealand. And they sometimes that would happen on other days as well, depending on what the protesters were actually doing. But it didn't start like that. It wasn't like that at the start. We trained. I went away and for 3 months as one of the riot squad members, we came together as a group of guys and we trained. And we trained solidly to become very, very good at using batons and using what we call team policing tactics and formations, where we would come together as a group, and we were young, we were fit, everyone was about my size. Some of the guys in my section and in my squad were way bigger than I was, which was always good to hide behind them when things were being thrown. So they were in the squad, and we were training every day, 12 hours a day, training, sleeping, eating, living away in barracks, getting up again the next morning, running, training. So you can imagine that we were getting better and better at what we were doing. So the South African rugby team arrives in New Zealand. We didn't think they'd actually arrive. We thought they were going to call the tour off, and all that training and all that time that we'd had away from our loved ones, living together for 3 months, was just going to be written up as a great experience for a young man, and he would have gone and enjoyed a really, really good time with all his mates. There was not going to be no Springbok Tour. We'd all get paid our allowances and our extra duties. Lots of the guys had already calculated that they could buy themselves a brand new car with the money they were going to get for that 3 months, and then they arrived. And they played their first game. So on the 22nd of July, and I'm only going to talk about the first 2 weeks of the Springbok Tour, because I think that is when it all went wrong. So on the 22nd of July, the Springbok played their first game. They arrived on the 19th, and the South African rugby team, when they arrived, they were transported to Gisborne, and they were welcomed by the local Gisborne Māori community there, and they were welcomed onto the same marae that they welcomed the 1965 Springbok team. They did exactly the same process that they did in 65 as a little bit of a throwback to historically where it was. I and my squad weren't deployed to Gisborne. We were asked to stay in Wellington, and I'll explain a little bit more about why we stayed in Wellington, but not many of those riot squad members were actually sent to Gisborne, and Gisborne was a violent event. They pulled all the fences down around the rugby park, but the local police, who had come in from all different parts of the upper North Island, managed to keep the protesters from invading the pitch, and they actually played the game. So they played Poverty Bay in Gisborne, and they won the game. So the Springbok won that game. And everyone realised this was for real at that stage. But the violence and the disorder was not to the level that we were expecting. So the next game that we had was the game against in Hamilton against Waikato, and they went to that to Hamilton, and on the 25th, so we only got a few days in between each game, they arrived, and it was a Saturday, and they were going to play Waikato, and a few things happened. First thing that happened was I wasn't deployed. I was lucky enough, 2 other members in my squad were lucky enough to go and play our club rugby. We were playing senior A rugby in Wellington, and I got to go and play for Plymouth Parramatta against Upper Hutt. So I played a senior A club game. And straight after the game, we got into our blazers and ties. That's what you did in those days when you played rugby, you all dressed up. I went to the club rooms, they had speeches, and we were all going to settle in and watch this game that was going to be televised on TV, colour television in the club rooms. So we sat down with a jug to enjoy the company of our teammates. I was sitting there with my 3 mates. We were all police officers. They all knew we were in the squad. They didn't know why we weren't in Hamilton, because all the other guys were in Hamilton. We knew why we weren't in Hamilton, but we knew we had Saturday free. And when the game came on, so they finally crossed to the field, they announced that the game had been cancelled. And a couple of things happened. What happened was a guy by the name of Pat Macquarie, an ex-World War II fighter pilot, managed to get into an aeroplane in Tokyo and radioed ahead to say that he was, if the game was to be played, he had made threats that he would fly the plane into the grandstand at Hamilton. So the police were gathering all that intel. Now, Pat was pretty famous. He'd already done this type of thing before. I don't know if many of you play softball, but in '78, the South African softball team came to New Zealand and played the New Zealand softball team. And in Papakura, he'd fly on a plane over the top of it, and he was the first one to start throwing flower bombs out of the plane onto the softball diamond because he was so opposed to apartheid in South Africa. So Pat stole a plane. So he had a plane that was flying around, a Cessna, you know, the smaller planes flying around in the air, buzzing over the top of Hamilton. And then what happened is the protesters took some tools. They'd learned a few things from the Poverty Bay game, and that it took too long to actually get into the ground, so they took some wire cutters so they could quickly cut the fence and get in through the back fence and get onto the ground. And the police thought that because the fences were better in Hamilton, that they wouldn't be able to actually come in other than come through the gates, expecting the protesters to come in through the normal gates and entranceways, but they didn't. They cut all the wire on the fences and they ran into the ground, over the embankment, and they ran down onto the ground. So my view of the game in Waikato was watching all these people on the rugby field in Hamilton, standing in the middle of the field, arms linked, refusing to move off the rugby field. and the Commissioner of Police at the time, Bob Walton, quite a nice guy, he made the decision that the game would be cancelled. They cancelled the game. So I went from being one of those guys that was going to sit and watch a game of rugby in the rugby club rooms to a guy that had to leave the club rooms because people were asking myself and my teammates, you should be up there so we can watch our game of rugby. So, let's have a look at what was happening in Hamilton and what was the protesters and how they were engaging with the police there. So, you can see a lot of the guys aren't wearing their riot helmets. They're being pretty gentle, and picking up and physically just helping people get off the ground. They're in their blue helmets, and everything's pretty organised, pretty seamless. Be honest, the police were surprised at how quickly the protesters got onto the ground, how they did not respond as quickly as they should do, but of course what became quite clear was the people that were there to watch their rugby game became incensed that there was no game of rugby, and you can see towards the end as they were being taken off the field, people started throwing cans at them, cans of our beer and bottles and things like that. And I can remember one of the leaders of the protest movement, John Minto, actually got hit with a full can of beer and actually knocked him out. He was knocked unconscious by that, by being struck in the head with that can of beer. So the game was cancelled, and it became known throughout the world that the protesters had stopped the tour of the Springbok in New Zealand. Nelson Mandela was in Robben Island. He was imprisoned on Robben Island at that time, and he made the comment that it was quite a joyous occasion for all those political prisoners when they heard that the New Zealand protest movement had stopped the game of rugby because they knew how the South African culture enjoyed rugby so much, and that was what he believed a win for them. So the game cancelled on Saturday. We get phoned up and told we knew while we were in Wellington, we were there because the National Party had their National Party conference, and that we were to mobilise immediately on Saturday, and we were all to be at a certain location with all our gear ready to start doing what we were doing. So we went and we were present to protect the National Party members at their National Party conference in Wellington. And on Wednesday the 29th, there was meant to be a game against Taranaki in New Plymouth. And it was believed that the protesters would stop that game, and Robert Muldoon would then make an announcement that the tour would be called off because the protesters had stopped games. But he'd sent a message that that wasn't to happen. Now, he wasn't in New Zealand on Wednesday the 29th of July because other things were happening in the world. On that day, Princess Diana and Prince Charles were married. So he was at the wedding of Diana and Charles in London. So other people were making announcements. And what happened was the game in Taranaki was played. They flooded the area with police. The protesters could not get onto the ground and stop the game. No matter what they did, the police were organised. So the guys that were up in New Plymouth, the squad members that were in New Plymouth, they and all the other police officers there managed to get the game played between Taranaki and the Springbok, and of course Springbok won that game. But that wasn't the end of the day, because most of the protesters had gathered in Wellington to celebrate the stop of the tour, because the National Party, which Robert Muldoon was the leader of, and he was the Prime Minister of New Zealand, was going to make this announcement, and they would cheer and gloat and say, yes, we had stopped the tour. But they didn't. The game went ahead, and later on that day, when they realised that it was not going to be a success for them, they mobilised, and there were skirmishes between my squad and protesters throughout the whole afternoon and into the evening. And it was on that day that I believe that the whole Springbok Tour turned from seeing police officers in Hamilton just shepherding people off the ground, wearing blue helmets instead of riot helmets, just having their buttons in their holders. You saw in the introduction what it ended up being like in those last few weeks of the tour. This is the day when it all happened, and this is the day that police battened protesters. We took our batons out and we battened protesters. And it was at a place called Molesworth Street in Wellington. Molesworth Street runs up beside Parliament buildings. We'd received information that the protesters, which were gathering in and around Lambton Quay, were going to march on the South African ambassador's residence, which was in Molesworth Street. Everything was blocked off, so they only had one area that they could actually walk into and come up, and it was row and row and row of police officers. Molesworth Street would have been the width of the Speirs Centre, and you can imagine police officers shoulder to shoulder with blue helmets and wooden batons lined up 8 or 9 rows. And then behind them was myself and my squad with our riot helmets and our long batons directly behind them. And the protesters came in. It was now dark, so they had changed their plan from going to the South African ambassador's residence to actually getting into Parliament and trying to get into Parliament buildings itself. And the word was given they're not to enter Parliament buildings. The police are to stop them at whatever and do whatever it takes to do that. So what happened was the tide turned and protesters were battened for the first time. They weren't as prepared for it as they were later in the tour. They weren't wearing any motorbike helmets or had any padding or things like that. They didn't have boots and that on. Most of the people at the front of the protest were elderly people or young people. The more staunch members weren't at the front lines, but that all changed after Molesworth Street when everything deteriorated. So let's have a little bit of a look at this, what Molesworth Street is, and there's a little bit of footage now. I've edited this heavily. I don't think you need to see or hear all the screams and things that occurred in Molesworth Street. I was there. All I need to say is that it was an extremely violent and frightening event. So frightening and so shocking to the police that were present. It's something we'd never ever been involved in before, that when we finally were stood down around about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the morning, and we got onto our bus to go back to the police college where we were staying in the barracks there, no one spoke on the bus as we went back. Guys were bloodied, hurt, all our gear had to be gathered up, we sat in the bus and no one spoke. No one uttered a word. It was the quietest the squad had ever been in the entire 81 Springbok Tour. When we got back to the to the police college. Of course, in those days, there was a message sent around that the bar would be open for the staff that were at Molesworth Street, and we went in and we had a few drinks just to unwind. And then we were told that at 6:30 in the morning we needed to be out of our beds in our PT gear, ready to run, and we would run around about 7 or 8 mile, and we would end up in one of the bays around Plymouton, Paramata, and we would all have to go into the water and swim for some distance. That was the sort of stuff we did. That was an encouragement not to drink too much the night before. When I ranked up in my section, there were 6 of us, plus a sergeant in charge of the section, and the section's created and formed into a squad. The man and we were all given a number, that's where we had to stand. I remember the man behind me wasn't there, and the man on the end of our section wasn't there, so I quickly ran up to get the man that was behind me, and the guy in front of the guy at the back, he ran to his room. I knocked on my mate's door and said, "Mate, you better get down, because we'll all be punished if you're not down there, because we are starting our run at 6:30, and he told me to resign from the New Zealand Police Force. So instead of doing what we did and go to the bar, he found a typewriter and he typed up his resignation and resigned from the New Zealand Police Force, because that's not what he signed up to do as a police officer. And so did the other guys. So the squad went from this big to this big after one night. They spent some time giving those men an opportunity to what we call a cool down period of 24 hours, and a lot of them held on to their resignation letters and said that they would put those in at the end of the tour. They didn't want to see any of their mates who we'd built quite a strong bond after 4 months of being together. We'd built a strong bond. They didn't want to see any of their mates get hurt, so they would do it for their mates but for nobody else, and that's why they did it. So this is Molesworth Street.
One of the bloodiest battles happened here, on the doorstep of Parliament. Police used batons to stop protesters walking up Molesworth Street to the South African ambassador's home.
Just a peaceful march on a document.
Police and protesters agree, had the tour gone on longer, someone would have died.
All the bits out. We don't need to see anything. It's not about glorifying anything that happened there. It's not about sort of celebrating anything, because it was a terrible event in the history of New Zealand. But the footage after that is quite confronting, and I don't think you need to be seeing any of that. Boys, I'm now going to stop, because on the 1st of August, the Springboks play Manawatū. I'm going to leave the players and the supporters and the protesters to Manawatū. I'll get a break.
Morena tātou, ngā mihi ki a koutou o te rā ki o kua, tēnā o ki koutou, ngā Anthony, tēnā ki mō tērā, ngā Angie, nei rā taku mihi mata kui kui. Well, I've got to thank Pai Anthony for framing this up really well, providing a context for me to take over and just contribute a smaller portion, but I think equally as important, I suppose, creating the bigger picture. I do have to correct him on one thing. We turned 21 that year. At that time, in 1981, I was in my final year at Palmerston North Teachers College, and one of the things that research has shown us is that most of those protesters, over 49% of the protesters, were people who had university entrance and or were in tertiary studies, which is interesting. We know that the Springbok Tour was highly contentious. It it did have the most impact in terms of civil disruption within New Zealand, and certainly that's something quite significant, you know, for us. They say that 150,000 people participated in the protests over 28 destinations or events over 56 days. I don't know about that, to be honest. Previously, in another life, I was a history teacher, and when we had done the 1918 influenza pandemic, they had said, 8,736 people died in New Zealand of that, but then we discovered that none of those statistics included Māori. And they never actually kept records of how many Māori were alive or had passed away in that time. So I don't know about that either. We didn't have computers in that time. If we did, it was quite rudimentary as a tool. I think for my part, I was a anti-tour person. That was my stance and that of many of my friends. My father's name was Mr. Marshall, and my mother laughed because it was always a standing joke in the family. Mr. Marshall was a marshal in the Springbok Tour. In saying that, she wasn't laughing when her sister didn't speak to her for 3 years because of my father and I taking that position within our family of being anti-tour. In saying that, my auntie, my mum's sister, did speak to us, but she didn't speak to my mother for 3 years. So, you know, it did impact many people. I suppose being at Teachers College, my peer group were by and large very supportive of the anti-tour movement. And in saying that, my father was a freezing worker, someone who had been highly unionised. He was a union rep. The unions played a significant role in the anti-tour movement, and they had mobilised, I suppose, well and truly before that. Most of those who were at the freezing works, a fair number were people of colour. Should I say they were Māori, Pacifica, and hence I think that they saw, if anyone supported that they were supporting the apartheid regime in South Africa. So hence they took a stance of being anti-tour against apartheid. It, as I mentioned, it deeply divided people in New Zealand, and you saw some of those clips. For Māori, I'm speaking as a Māori woman, I think that, and not all Māori were, Māori were on both sides, but those Māori who were anti-tour felt that the government was saying, oh, we come to New Zealand, we're really good, we're racially harmonious, we get on well, we don't have any issues. Right from the beginning, we've had a wonderful time or relationship. Well, in fact, people like myself were thinking, that's not right. Look at Pahiatua. Look at the confiscation of land. That we still have iwi around the country saying we've got grievances about that. You're selling off land to other people, to developers, instead of bringing it back to us to have the opportunity, and we'll buy it if we need to, but in fact, that land was given, let's say, for a school, for a church, and then you decide to close the school or the church, and then that gets sold on to someone else. So that's the kind of, I suppose, situation that Māori felt wasn't quite right. And I'm referring to my notes because there's so much to do and I better stick to time. The Springbok Tour brought about some significant outcomes from my mind, from my perspective. And I think it was an increased awareness. And Mr. Lobb had mentioned that about Nelson Mandela saying that when they had heard that the game in Hamilton had been called off, he said, to quote him, or something like that, he said that it was a day when the sunshine came out. And we know internationally, prior to that, New Zealand had signed in 1977 the Gleneagles Agreement, in which all the Commonwealth Games, presidents, prime ministers, were part of an international campaign to say, look, South Africa, we don't like what you're doing there. So that's, that's not where we want to be, that's not what we support. So sort yourself out or else we're not going to play with you. And New Zealand had signed up to that. But lo and behold, I think those who were anti-tour were like, Rob Montour, what are you doing? You signed that on behalf of our country, and then now you're sort of sending us mixed messages, and you're allowing Cesc Blasey and his cohort to invite South Africa over here when you know everything that's gone down in recent years. We're not talking about the other times, but even in recent years with Soweto and all that. There was social and political impact, without a doubt. There were also, I suppose, one of the outcomes that was significant was the legacy of activism, and it was pivotal within New Zealand, demonstrating that power of collective thought, good or action, to deal with issues of injustices as people had seen it. And interestingly enough, when I was very quickly last night reviewing some papers that I'd had, was that they said with the judicial system, right at the end of all this, when 1,500 people who were anti-protesters had gone through the court system, they'd said one person, his observation was that New Zealand judicial system didn't deal with poverty, the injustices of poverty, or where people were socially or political injustices. It was all about just the breaking of the law and so forth, about civil disobedience, but it didn't actually attend to other deeper aspects. From a Māori perspective, I suppose the big thing was the solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement. The protests also provided the opportunity to voice our sort of concerns about the misapprehension that was being put across, that in New Zealand everything was fine and dandy. So Māori was saying, well actually, we've got many grievances, but they're always pushed under the carpet. And we don't support what's happening there. We've experienced it. And it highlighted the racial inequalities, the disparities, I suppose. One of the things that we found definitely abhorrent was the fact that Māori players were faced exclusion in 1928, in 1949, and in 1960. And then, as Mr. Lobb had said, that when they did go over to South Africa and play there, they were classified as honorary whites. For players being excluded based on their ethnicity, that was deeply hurtful and demoralising, not only for them, but for their whānau, for their iwi, their hapu, their whānau. Also, Māori felt a strong sense of injustice with those exclusions. We know that we had, well, I mean, when I think of George Napier, one of the best players in rugby, I mean, you can't, if you were to go anywhere around the world where they love rugby or play rugby, they know who George Napier was. Yet he, who was touted as being one of the best rugby players ever, wasn't able to go over there. You know, he wasn't the only one, there are others as well. But Māori felt indignant and thought, just a minute, we fought side by side in World War I, World War II, and other wars like in Malaysia and Korea, and yet we're not good enough to fight, to play, should I say, for our country, to represent our country at the highest level. And of course, Mr. Lobb's quite right. In the 80s, it was the pinnacle of any New Zealand family to say we've got an All Black in our family. And, you know, that's what most people strive for. Many, many years ago, I was a principal of an all-boys school, and funnily enough, we'd have pre-interviews before they would come, enrolment interviews, and I'd ask them, what do they want to be? And look, 9 times out of 10, they all said, oh, well, I want to play professional rugby, and of course I want to be an All Black. So I think that that sort of aspiration is still there. But we felt with the exclusion of people going to play going to play rugby over those decades, that marginalised us even further. And that, of course, not only that, but the rugby union, I think they lost a great deal of credibility from woe to go on this, but the very fact that they came out then and said, well, actually, no, we're not going to send the Māori over to South Africa because it wouldn't be good for them. It could be, you know, they could have people saying that they're not up to speed, they're not, you know, equal with us, so we want to save them. But they still took teams over, despite that, which of course was really demoralising. Protesting in New Zealand had gathered some momentum by 1981. We had had the Vietnam War in the late 1960s and 1970. I'm looking at why she's giving me the signal timer. And also the Mururua nuclear testing, that was significant. So people were becoming conscientised to things that they felt very strongly against. With the Vietnam War, I think it was the tactics and the weapons that were used against people there. With Mururua, with the French testing their nuclear bombs, which didn't finish until 1996, they decided they actually had gone underground, but still, despite Pacific nations saying our fish are dying, our children have been born with disabilities, they still persisted. I was, as was mentioned there, Manawatū and protesting. I had a father who was very, very involved. He made sure that him and I had our helmets, but he wouldn't allow me to go at the front. I had to go at the back. When Pahiatua and I, we were going out together, and we were young people then. He would phone me most nights just to see how I was. We were talking. And my father would say things after the phone call like, how is Anthony? Where is he? And I used to say to my father, I'm not giving you any intel. But of course I worried about him because there were times too when people would use weapons and put them, knives and other things. I think there was a fire that was lit under a flare put under the helmet of someone, and they'd been badly burnt. There were just not only the psychological harm, but also the physical harm as well. In saying that, I do believe, you know, that those of us who were anti-tour were very adamant about the reasons why we were taking that stance and that position. We did lose some friends along the way. We had one person say she'd never come to our wedding, she wouldn't come to our wedding. She hasn't spoken to us since because Pahiatua was a police officer. So that's how deep it goes. Of course, my auntie started speaking to my mother, not after that. She was always good with me, but it did caused great divide. I'm really pleased to be up here. Pa Bruce, Hemara and I grew up together. We had a joyous occasion when he was made an All Black. So the whole community in Palmerston North, and especially the Māori community, were really proud. So I'm going to enjoy listening to him as well later, and Mr. Truter, and Mr. Carlton as well, but thank you for the opportunity. Kia ora koutou.
Right, and on the other side, you had the likes of me. Just to give you a bit of background, I was brought up in Pahiatua, small rural town. The rugby club was sort of the hub of the town. It brought everybody together every weekend, and everybody followed rugby. And obviously, rugby was the be-all and end-all in my young days when I was your age. If we go back to 1965 when the Springbok Tour was over here, that's my sort of first recollection of a big tour. They played 30-odd games, went through the country, and there was probably no unrest. I was actually a supporter of the South African team purely because of rugby. I wasn't politically motivated or informed. I did have university entrance, but over in Pahiatua we had the newspaper and the television, and I only read the sports page on the newspaper, probably like most young guys my age from over there. Sport was important. 1973, there was a proposed Springbok Tour to New Zealand, and that was cancelled because of the apartheid system, what we're talking about. I'm not pro-apartheid. When I was at school, apartheid wasn't a word that was used, that I understood, that I knew anything about. It was only when you got through to the 70s, and in 1981 I was mid-20s. I was still heavily rugby sport orientated, and I felt at the time that politics shouldn't interfere with sport. How was sport going to change the regime that was in South Africa? Yes, if the tour was cancelled, it may have upset, made them annoyed, the regime that was in control, but it wouldn't have changed anything. And I understand that you need to fight little battles all the time to make that change. But at the time, I was sport orientated and I supported the Springbok Tour here. I didn't go on any marches. I went to the game here in Manawatū. I'm not sure how far through the tour that was, but it was after all the incidents that Mr. Lobb explained. And they stayed in a hotel over in Fitzherbert Ave, and there were people outside that hotel making a noise all night so they couldn't sleep. Unless you were there, you weren't aware of that. Went to the game. I knew there was things happening because we'd seen the results of the Waikato game and all that, and the other events that Mr. Lobb mentioned. But we just went to the game, got there early, and saw inside barbed wire all around the field. People were trying to stop the game by throwing tennis balls with tacks in and glass onto the field. But inside that, just outside the playing surface, there was a ring of police all the way around there. They were shoulder to shoulder basically, no further than that far apart. So after the initial games of the tour, the police upped their numbers and their strategies and that to avoid people getting on the paddock, protesters getting on the paddock to stop the game. The game went ahead, watched the game. Springboks won, don't know the score, but it didn't really have any glory or lasting impact other than the police presence. And then we went down to the test match in Wellington, which would have been halfway through the tour, the second test. And that was a little bit more dramatic. We realised that you had to get there early, and so we're going to the game not knowing what we're walking into. Fortunately for us, we were walking to the streets to the game, and it was just like a battlefield. The results of the battlefield afterwards. There were debris everywhere. The big containers that you see on the back of trucks, they were put in the streets to channel the people that were going to the game through a narrow entry so they could control who was going in and what they had. The action that happened before we got there were people sitting in the gutters nursing their injuries and debris all around, shields, helmets, just what was sort of thrown in and left behind. Get to the game, got in the park, got to our seats. There were 5 or 6 helicopters hovering above Athletic Park. You guys don't remember Athletic Parks, not the Cape Town. It was an older stand park with stands and that. It was packed out, helicopters up there, and barbed wire, police everywhere. It was just like almost like a prison. It was so heavily guarded, and that sort of kept the lid on the can sort of thing. And the game went ahead. Springboks won, carried on their way, and went home afterwards. Missed all the drama. I haven't got any action stories for you. In my day, when I was at school at your age, we had Sir Brian Lahore, who was the captain of the All Blacks in 1970 that went to South Africa. He come and spoke to us, and he gave us his thoughts on his reason for touring South Africa. He actually said that he thought it would help. Once the 1970 tour got underway over there, where we had, I think there were six Māori All Blacks. One of them, and obviously Brian Williams, who was a sensation. And they watched him play and supported the All Blacks. Possibly not just because of the fact that there were coloured players in the All Blacks, but it was obviously not supporting their own team. But so Sir Brian Lahore came and spoke at school, and probably I revered him. So if it was good enough for him to say that he could play over there, that was good enough for me to further enhance my thoughts, good or bad, right or wrong, on why I should continue to support South Africa coming over here. I mean, it was purely based on sport and love of rugby. And as time goes on, and we're made more aware of what goes on, what went on in South Africa, and I can only say that your opinions change when you actually see what the conditions were. And that's life, you know. But at the time, I was an avid supporter because of sport, not supporting the regime that was in power in South Africa. And that's basically my story. And I still love rugby, still support rugby, but Nelson Mandela is one of my heroes. So there's no way I support apartheid. That's basically me.
My perspective about 1981 tours from a player's point of view, just a bit of background. I came to Boys High in 1971 to 1975. I was in the first 15 from 1973 to 75 and captain in 75. I played junior rugby at Manawatū from junior 12, under 16, under 18 and then Carlton. In 1977 I was in the Manawatū rugby team, senior team. In that period of time we had the Round for the Shield. My whole world revolved around rugby. Everything, I worked, I had a job, I worked in the freezer works, I was a meat inspector at one move. But apart from that, everything I did was to do with rugby. That's what I thought about. In 1980, Manawatū were the NPC champions. In 1981, we were the defending champions when the Springboks Tour. We were probably considered their fifth test outside the four tests that they played against the All Blacks. So the community, Manawatū at that stage was very supportive of Manawatū rugby, and it was a big, it was considered to be one of the biggest matches around. We had 20,000 people come to the game. So that's perspective or context of my experience. In terms of the politics, my thoughts were that sports shouldn't be involved with politics. People who supported the tour, that was their choice to support the tour. People who didn't, it was their choice to protest. For the government, it became a law and order around the protests. And that was the people that I was involved with, the people that were in my world, in my environment. That was how they thought of the rugby tour. The game itself was the biggest game for Manawatū, basically in their history to play the Springboks. They were the opposition everyone wanted to play. And we were at the time defending champions of the NPC, so everything in 1981 was looking forward to playing the Springboks. Just leading up to that particular game, we were aware of the protests that were going on, but we were pretty much isolated or insulated from what was going on. Okay, obviously the communication and the way people got the news was a bit more limited then, but we saw some stuff, but then again, our whole perspective, or my perspective, was that it was a law and order issue, not something to do with the tour. We supported the tour, we wanted to play the Springboks. So on the day, on the build-up into that particular game, we trained on the Tuesday and the Thursday before the Saturday game. We knew the game before that, Waikato game had been called off. So, we were expecting maybe the security would be a little bit more intense for our game. On the Tuesday night, about 7 o'clock at night, we were training under lights. At about 7, all hell broke loose. The army turned up, police turned up, containers were put across the back of the field to prevent people from coming through the back entrance of the showgrounds. Barbed wire was put up all around the park, and that remained there until about 2 weeks after the game. So, everybody knew it was going to be a big game to be involved in. And because the game previous, the Waikato game had been called off, I guess the idea was to make sure that the next game was played. So we really look forward to playing against what we consider to be the next best team in the world as a province. We had 20,000 people come to the game. We assembled at what's now the Distinction Hotel, we used to be called the Carlton. We assembled there at 11 to prepare for the game. The Springboks were taken under the stand at the showgrounds back then at 8 in the morning, just to avoid any protests or to avoid any incidents. So they were sitting in the grandstand from 8 o'clock in the morning. Our kick-off was at 2:30 that particular day. So they waited for that whole period of game, and they went out of the grandstand, they had to stay. And back in those days, the grandstand was about the size of 3 toilets. It was very small, but that was the security that they were put under to make sure that nothing happened to them as players. When we got to the ground, we trained, we had our normal routine of meal at the hotel, and we were bussed to the game at about 12. To be a little bit earlier than we normally go, I guess. But and even then, there were big numbers of people at the showgrounds. We could see the police lined up along Cuba Street, right down towards David Street, waiting for the protesters to come. So we avoided them just after we arrived at the ground. There were big spring protesters that came through. They were blocked from coming towards the showgrounds, and they were ushered off to where the railway land is now. So, in terms of control, I guess we didn't see anything compared to what had been happening at other venues or grounds. In terms of the game, it was for us like a test match. We were, I guess, I think it was 19-0 towards, with about 10-15 minutes to go in that particular game. So, after the game, we met with the Springboks, we went to dinner with the Springboks. It was interesting that the hotel that they were staying at, there was another room above where the dinner was held, and the Red Squad, or the police contingent, were having a big party at the top. So I think they were celebrating the fact that there were no incidents in that particular game as well. Also, it was the reserve for the Māori All Blacks when they played in Napier against the Springboks. That game finished at 9-6, and there were a big contingent of Māori players that were very keen to play against the Springboks. Well, again, it was the idea of politics not being involved in sport. I remember the morning of the game, we were in a hotel or motel, opening the curtains about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was a protester with his face up against the window, looking in trying to get our attention. As close curtains that we were breakfast. But they were very, very, and there were lots of Māori protesters as well that were around the hotel. Again, for us, it was a matter of choice. If people were free to protest, free to air their opinions, we were also free to do what we thought was right in terms of being able to play and to keep the politics and sport separate. But that was our attitude. In retrospect, I think that attitude's probably shifted quite a bit since then. I think maybe a little bit naive back then to think about how sport has become very much a political football in lots of ways, but that was our experience, or that was my experience in terms of playing in that game, being involved in that particular tour. I think, and saying that, there were a few of the Springbok players from that tour who did become good friends of mine. So, in that, I think they've changed as well. Okay. So that's a short perspective from a post point of view about the 1981 Springbok Tour. Kia ora.
Just to wake you up, especially that fellow over there who's been sleeping all the time. Dudes, that's me. Alright, so I'm talking to you about what it was like in South Africa at this time. Now, I was 18 years old. That photo there, I'm 18 years old. Compulsory military service, so it means we had to go to the army for 2 years. I joined the army when I was 17, straight out of school. But I need to get you into a context. Every morning in the army, we stood inspections. There was our bed, and I'm just going to come and stand in here because I want to point it out to you. Oh shit, not bad for an old fella. Oh, you're for doing that, aren't you? Or we can edit that word out. Right, so that was our bed, and that was a towel. We used to have to comb the towel. Neat stripes, inspection, everything had to be perfect. There was a cubicle in which my military uniform, there you see my jacket, there was pants, my hat, that was all stored in there. There was a metal helmet that you had to have. Boots, you had to be able to see your face in your boots. You had to polish your boots so they shone. Boots up on the top there on a shelf. We had to stand at attention there. Web belt and my web belt hanging over there. My rifle, see that was the rifle that we had. That was one I made out of wood, don't panic. That was exactly to scale, the rifle that we had when we were fighting in this war. And we were lined up. So what I want you to picture, is this is what our accommodation looked like. Except I want you to picture those steel cabinets between the beds and the rifles on our beds ready for inspection every morning. And in the corner, in that far corner, so you're in the far corner there's an entranceway. That's where our bombardiers, people with rank, that's where they slept. And in this corner and behind us was this TV that Mr. Lobb was talking about, this brick of a thing. If you've ever had to take 4 guys to carry it, it was a small screen, no 55-inch. We were lucky if it was about the size of this laptop. It was really, really small. And how many beds? You guys can do the quick maths. 1, 2. Each of those was a soldier my age, fresh out of school. 5 o'clock in the morning, freezing cold because it's winter there as well. Absolutely freezing cold. Outside our dormitory, we had ice buckets. Sorry, not ice buckets, fire buckets. Red fire, metal fire buckets in case there was a fire in the dormitory and you could put out your fire. Ice was that thick on the top of the buckets. It was really cold, fellas. Absolutely freezing. So we had to get up extra early because there was a real special event happening. Obviously New Zealand was playing South African rugby. So there we were, all of us in the corner, huddled together, cold as anything, rifles lying all over the place, but pretty much our beds were made, everything ready for inspection, except for the few beds that we were going to go and sit on the corner. All of us, like you guys here, all of us really tightly grouped, fixated, watching this TV. There was this game of rugby was going to start. Now, I need to take you back a little bit. There's a saying, don't ever, when you talk to strangers, talk about religion or politics, because you end up having a scrap. Because eventually, at some point in that discussion, you're going to challenge somebody's beliefs. Now, what do you hate? Being challenged on what you think is right, what you believe adamantly is right. Third thing, indoctrination. Scary, the extent to which we are indoctrinated every day, and we've got absolutely no idea what's happening. Somebody decides what's going to go on the news every night. Somebody does. They decide what stories they're not going to show you. They're going to decide which stories they are going to show you. And that's just on the news. In South Africa, this was a whole new level. In South Africa, we were more communist than the communists. We had a secret service that made the KGB look scary. The problem was that when we were growing up as kids, we had no idea that existed. We had no idea that there was a secret service tapping into all sorts of things. We had no idea that everything we saw on this TV was being controlled by the government. Church. We were all raised to be good Christian boys. You go to school, and good Christian girls, good Christian people. And you go to church every Sunday. If we imagine this is the church, the back section over there, that was reserved for anybody who wasn't white. The rest of this was where anybody who was white could sit. This was the altar up here, and the priests, everybody was white. And that was the norm. We grew up believing that that was the norm. Black people, if they wanted to come to the white church, they could sit in a little area at the back there that was reserved for them. I used to hand out their hymn books to them as they walked in. I greeted them politely, they greeted me, everything was great. But that's where they had to sit. I remember my dad, I was really, really embarrassed. One black person walked in and they came and sat over here. My dad got up and went over and said, look, you can't sit there. You've got to go and sit there. It was the first time I experienced my dad being a South African. I'd never noticed that before. Religion. We learned about apartheid in our church. Gays, transgender, all that. It was a no-no, mate. That just never, ever, don't go there in a church. There was no ways that was ever going to be accepted in South Africa in my age, in my time. So what you've got to realise is this person that I'm talking to you about, that 18-year-old that we had up there, is very, very different to the person standing up here talking to you now. I'm trying to put you into my shoes back there. School. In school, we got shown photos of what black people did, and how they looked, and how they behaved, what they lived in. Definitely wasn't fancy houses. They definitely didn't wear a collar and a tie. We were indoctrinated in our schools every day in apartheid. We had no idea that was happening. It was normal. It was normal for black people at the end of the day to get on a bus and go to live in. Because that was the closest place they were allowed to live, to Palmerston North. And the next morning, they'd get on a bus or a train and they'd drive back into Palmerston North. Then they'd come and work in the factories. You know what? They seemed to be happy. They seemed to be given the impression, we were given the impression that they thought they had a pretty good deal. This was our normal. Right? This was our normal. Now, let's go back to 1976. The riots. I was in year 9 then. schools for black people were built by white people. Black people didn't pay tax. White people paid tax. Schools for black people were built by white people. Hospitals for black people were built by white people. You couldn't go to the same hospital. There's no ways a black person could go to a white hospital, or a white person would ever think of going to a black hospital. So in 1976, when the schools started getting burnt down, we were told that these black people were so ungrateful for what we white people had been doing for them by building them schools and giving them books and providing them with teachers, and that there was this power, there was this influence, this underbelly that was growing in South Africa that was causing these people to do really bad things. It was way, way later on, way later in my life, that I discovered the real reason was all their books were in Afrikaans. And they were told that every lesson would be taught in Afrikaans. And they had to write everything in Afrikaans. And Afrikaans was a language spoken by the Afrikaner, not by me. I'm an Englishman. But I had to learn Afrikaans. That's another story. We'll get to that maybe later. We didn't know that. We weren't taught that. We weren't shown that. How did that happen? Remember I said to you we were probably more communist than the communists? The government controlled the media. The government controlled everything we heard of. And this is what they told us. There's something called the Swart Kafar. Swart means black, Kafar means danger. Black danger. The communists were coming. You know how in New Zealand we don't like the colonialists because of colonization. Well, that happened in Africa too. And the problem that we were taught in South Africa, the problem we were taught was that the blacks didn't like the colonialists. The colonialists were British and America and all those European countries. And so what they wanted to do was align themselves with the Soviet Union. And that the communists were coming. The communists were on their way to South Africa. They'd taken over Tanzania, they'd taken over Mozambique, Zambia, Angola, and they were on their way. There was South Africa at the bottom. Now, just for perspective, can you see my little mouse down there? So from there to there, that's where we'd fit the North Island. So South Africa is a pretty big place. All right, but the communists were coming. Mandela was a communist. That's why he was in Robben Island, we were told. In fact, we were shown maps like this. That one, this one. We were told that there were 40,000, 70,000, 130,000, 36,000 Cuban troops. 60,000 in 1988, Soviet troops, guns, tanks, all of them funded by Cuba. It was on its way. They were heading towards Angola. They were heading towards Angola. And so we had to join the army, and we had to go and fight the communists in Angola. There they were coming. Southwest Africa was a country that South Africa administered. It didn't belong to us, but it pretty much did, because they didn't fight without permission from South Africa. So this is where we went and fought the war. Now, in 1981 was my first year out of school, my first year in the army. Propaganda. This is what we were shown. civilian cars burnt on fire. We had the supremacy, we had the airplanes, we had the tanks, we were told that we had friends. Oh, sorry. And we told that we had enemies. This dude, Swapo were the real baddies. They were the dudes that we had to go and kill. There is evidence of communist weapons. That's what our tanks and armament looked like as we were heading north to go and fight them. That's all of us, youngsters, more communist tanks, more communists teaching the Angolans how to fight us. We believed that we were doing the right thing, joining the army, going into war. In that barracks, going into war. We'd fought the First World War, we'd fought the Second World War with New Zealanders. You were our buddies. Now, let's go to sport. What was happening with sport at that time? Sanctions. No sport. You could not play sport against South Africa. You'd be blacklisted. So what did we do? We started playing sport within South Africa. We weren't going to play overseas. We'd play in South Africa. And this jersey here, my Sharks jersey, it became more important than my Springbok jersey. Because this jersey represented the English. You see, in South Africa, the English had fought the Afrikaners in the Boer War. They hated each other. The English, me, and I was an Afrikaner that became an Englishman, and that was even worse, but that's another story. We were the English. We were down here in the Cape Province and in Natal, and the Afrikaners, they were up north. They were in the Transvaal and the Free State. And so we created rugby games against each other. I was the Sharks, we had the Transvaal, we had the Free State, and when we played rugby against each other, we filled the stadium. It was like it was a test match. Filled the stadium. If you guys were going to boycott us, stuff you. We'll make our own competition. We're going to get better playing against ourselves. Stuff the rest of you if you don't want to play against us. Because you don't actually know what's going on in our country, we were told. How could you? You weren't even there. When we did, however, get together to pick a Springbok team, the English guys put all their politics to one side. And the Afrikaners put all their politics to one side. And the tribalism, the Sharks, and the Transvaal, the Northern Transvaal teams, what are they called? Bulls. Is that Bulls? Blue Bulls. We put our differences to one side. And we united as a people. No politics, because sport was more important than politics. And so when South Africa went on tour to New Zealand, there was an opportunity for a united South Africa to go on tour. To show that we can put our political differences to one side and go and play a game of rugby in New Zealand. And you guys were our buddies. We're sitting on our beds, freezing, you know what off, watching this little TV. And guess what we see? Chaos. Flower bombs. Aeroplanes coming in. Players being hit by powder. What the hell's going on, dudes? You're our buddies. And we hear that you don't like what we're doing. But we're fighting the communists. And all the blacks seem to be happy. That's because anybody who said anything against it got chucked in jail in Robben Island. going on here. It had the opposite effect to what I think the people protesting wanted. It made us want to fight more in the war. It made us go, stuff you. Just another sanction, just another whole lot of people who don't know what's going on. We became more entrenched in our apartheid ideas, and we got more entrenched in this feeling that we were fighting the rest of the world. Many, many, many years later, when we finally, thanks to Mandela and their whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when he said, let's put on the table what actually happened in South Africa. What was going on? Why did the Soweto riots happen? How many people had been killed by the Secret Service? How have we indoctrinated you? What is the truth? That we were appalled, shocked, horrified at how easy it is to take intelligent people. If you think all the Nazis were thick, you're wrong. There were very, very intelligent Nazis who were convinced that that was the right thing to do. And when you said that's the wrong thing to do, did you make them more of a Nazi or less of a Nazi? More of a Nazi. And so that's what the protests in the rugby did for me, and I'm ashamed. I'm ashamed that I was so influenced and so indoctrinated at that time in my life to think that what we were doing was right. And now, many, many, many years later, I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry that your country was ripped apart by those protests. That somebody still won't go to a wedding. The good, though, is that it did help and was a catalyst to change in South Africa, as it is now a catalyst to the change in your own country, our country. You see, we were told that the reason you guys were protesting was because you hadn't sorted out your own racial issues. And so you had no right to point your finger at us. Amazing how history has its way of working things through. All right? As long as we learn from our mistakes, and we don't continue making our mistakes. As long as we learn history, we use history to learn not to ever do that again, rather than to perpetuate it. And too much of our history perpetuates wrong ideologies. We don't realize we're doing it. We think we're doing it for your best good. We really do. But if we learn about indoctrination. You guys ask the hard questions, and well done to Mrs. Baines for having the courage to scratch this hornet's nest. Because it's got everything in it. It's got religion and how religion controls you. If you were born into a Muslim family, would you be Muslim? If you were born into a Christian family, would you be Christian? Religion. Politics. Indoctrination. Patriotism. Look at Trump and his patriotism. Everybody wants to be USA, USA. Patriotism. Blinded by indoctrination. The world's a scary place at the moment. And you guys have to be asking serious questions, like we did in your protests when we came on tour. Going, is that right? Is what we're doing right? How much have we been indoctrinated? How much are we doing to indoctrinate you? And is that right? Sorry that we've gone over time.
That's okay.
But that's my 18-year-old to 61-year-old perspective. Thank you, guys.
Boys, I won't hold you up too long. You sat very patiently with us for those 2 hours. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much to our speakers. That was fabulous, and I hope you guys have got something and taken something valuable away from that. So thank you very, very much. And just one more round of applause, and then we'll go. Okay.